Welcome to E39 Source. Ryan Schultz here. Again, we've got the 2000 M5, the 2006 sitting up there, and the 2016. But today we're working on the E60. We're going to do an alternator DIY. The alternator comes with a voltage regulator on it, and we're going to be replacing the accessory belt, serpentine belt, AC belt. It's just two, but whatever you want to call them. So we'll talk about some parts first. All of the parts required for this are going to be in the description to the video, so be sure to check that out instead of trying to pause and listen or take screenshots. The alternator itself, the original equipment manufacturer is Vallejo. If you want to save a little bit of money over the genuine BMW part, I do recommend the Vallejo. And I think that's a Vallejo specific part number there in the largest fonts. 439559. Again, that is just the alternator. It's held onto the engine with two bolts, a long one and a short one. The longer one is 119905523. The shorter one is 119905818. You'll need one of each. Then to replace the belts, we've got a long one and a short one. I'm not completely sure which is which. Check the description. I went with Continental. It's the same thing as the genuine BMW belt for half the price. On the left, 6PK1084, and then 6PK1432. So that should be parts required for the alternator. Now we're in the midst of other projects. So the car's already in the air, the bumper's off, the headlights are out. You don't need to do any of that. You will need to safely get under the vehicle. We've got a lift. Makes things a little easier. If you don't have a lift, that's fine. Use your front jacking point, jack it up from here, get it on jack stands, make sure it's safe in park or gear with the e-brake on. And a quick little shout out to this awesome little adapter here from ECS Tuning. This thing is perfect for BMWs. It fits right on your lift or jack stands or hydraulic jack. And then the other end grooves perfectly up into the jack pad adapter on the car. So you've got even less risk about the car moving and sliding around or a jack stand coming out. I'll leave the part number and a link to this part in the description below. And then we are going to need to remove the front belly pan as well. The frontmost belly pan directly under the engine is held on with four 13mm nuts, and that is it. So be careful when you take those out, it's going to come down. We can start to see the front oil cooler all the way back to the electric fan. Here is the alternator. It's on the bottom driver's side of the engine on the front. There's all of this stuff that's in the way, but we're firstly going to need to remove this electric fan, per the only DIY that I've read on this, that exists on this. So we're going to need to lower the car back down, open the hood, and figure out how to take that electric fan out. Since we are working on the alternator and electrical system, let's go ahead and disconnect the negative terminal on the battery. The battery on the M5 is in the center of the trunk. It's a 10mm nut on top. You don't need to remove it completely, just loosen it. Now we'll need to put something non-conductive in there so it doesn't match up and connect. Now from under the hood we need to remove the radiator cover. That is this large piece of metal trim here. It's going to be held on with 10 T30s. They're not these. These are out here on the cross member. So leave these two and those two. Anywhere where you see these holes now around the perimeter need to be removed. Then it will slide towards the engine. And it looks like we've got our hood Bowden cable is clipped in here somehow. So the hood latches in their entirety are attached to this, and I suppose our options would be to remove them from the top or just take the whole cables out of these little clips here in the chassis and just swing this whole thing, put a towel on the engine and swing it up there and get it out of the way. Upon closer inspection, we've got the two hood latches inside of this. Then there's a wiring harness for each hood latch, go figure. Another wire from that harness comes down here to the horns, and we've got the bumper off, so that's how I was able to determine that they are indeed the horns, and there's one on each side of the front. So with your headlight and bumper still installed here, I'm not exactly sure how you would go about. You might be able to have enough room. No, you are going to have to figure out how to disconnect those horns, which I would recommend headlight removal. It's not impossible on these cars, but they're not fun because they're really tight and you end up marking up your fenders or bumper. Maybe put some masking tape or electrical tape over all of that. Then the headlights are held in with four T30s, I believe. No, T30s up top. You've got one here and one here. Then down here, you'll look behind the headlight and they're 8 or 10s. I think they're 8mm bolts like the E39 that hold that in. Then we've retrofitted LCI lights on this, so there's one wiring harness for the LCI lights, and it's got little tabs on the side. You press the tabs in and pull the connector out. If your car's a 2006 or an early 07, and you still have the pre-LCI headlights, then you've got two wiring harnesses, one with a big block that slides down and then the connector comes out, and then the other one's a little tiny pinch for your levels. So take the headlights out, and then that will allow you to reach down in here, follow the wire, and disconnect it from the horn on each side. The horn connector looks like that. You just have to pinch the back of the tab so it releases and then wiggle the wire out. And again, there's one on each side. So once you've done that, then you're able to just push that entire radiator cover up on top of the engine. The only thing I did with the hood release cables here, they were pushed into this little grommet on the chassis. So I just kind of pried those fingers apart, pulled it out of just that connector, and then rotated it up here. So now that's out of the way, we can move on to removing the electric fan. BMW TIS states that there's supposed to be an AUC sensor right here. Well, either the M5 didn't get one or this one's missing it, and I don't see any wires for it. But if you've got a little air quality control sensor, whatever that thing is here, with some wires plugged into it, remove the wires. TIS is now worthless, so we're pioneering. There are 5 T25 or T27. The T27s seem to fit a little bit better. Torques that hold on this one with the bear sticker, this piece of plastic on top. There's also a few lines that just clip into it right here, one in the center, and right here. The 5 Torques I talked about, there's one center, kind of top left, and then there's one right there, and symmetrical on this side. So now that we've kind of removed all of that, looks like this part comes out at an angle, revealing a very dirty radiator and a lot more access for our electric fan now. So this electric fan is absolutely some of the worst design I've ever seen from BMW. This is it, oriented the right way, so this would be towards the engine and the back of the car, and it's got these little ears on the side of it that you have to fold 90 degrees over like this. And when you do, they make a horrible sound and then they come off. This side isn't broken, that's how it's supposed to work. When you put it back on, line up the hinges on the dowels, and then you give it another snap and it forces back into the lock position, and it won't allow you to raise it up out of the car like this because you have radiator hoses here which hit into the side of this ear. So to remove it, you have to force it over here and make it fall off and fall down into the car. Same thing over here, although we broke this one, so that one's not going to function anymore. Oh well, it'll stay in place. And then the only electrical connection here is this big plug that is this huge plug on the driver's side, and it's got 2 tabs, one on each side. Push the tabs towards the center, take the connector out. So now the electric fan is out of the way. We're going to put the car back up in the air and see what more we can see. Back underneath, that did gain us a good bit of room. We can now see all the way up. This is the back of the radiator here, and obviously the front of the engine and all the belts. So the belts are going to have to be removed, both of them. So you're going to want a picture, a diagram, a schematic, otherwise a way that you can know which way the belts go on. So get a camera up in there or go find something online, because when you go to put this back together, it's a zoo. So all of this crap, the TIS says unscrew and remove. Very specific. So I see what looks to be a 10 millimeter here. There's some more 10s over here. This one goes onto the block. I don't know. I'm just going to start taking the 10s out and let this thing hang. Be careful with it. These are AC lines. Okay, I'm going to try to film this as best as I can. There's 2 tensioner pulleys. We're looking at the car this way. The first one's right next to the alternator. It is right there. It's a 14 millimeter nut. So there's a little cap on there. Get a flathead screwdriver, pop the cap off, put a 14 millimeter on the end of a breaker bar, rotate it, and take the belt off after you've taken photos, of course. Then there's another one over here. Pop the cap off, another 14 millimeter nut, get your socket again on the breaker bar, rotate that, take that belt off. Now you'll see that the original belt we cannot fully remove because of this pulley up here. So we actually need to remove it. So there's yet another cap. Use the flathead to pop the cap off. Then there's going to be a bolt in there. We're going to take the bolt out, take the entire pulley off, and then we'll be able to remove this belt. Now if you're not replacing it, if you're going to reuse the same belt, then just leave it. But we've got new belts, so we've got to take the pulley off. It's a 16 millimeter nut on the pulley, and the pulley will only reinstall one way. So you can see it's got this big notch in it. So now that the pulley is off, we'll be able to take the belt off the very top, in theory. There's a hose in the way. Oh, I gotta work it around the hose, but the belt comes off. Now, finally into the meat and potatoes of this job, the alternator. And we've got all this bracketry in the way, and whatever the hell this thing is, I have no idea what this is. It's very heavy, it had an electrical connector on it, and it's on a braided line. Probably not ideal to let it suspend itself from that, but it's a braided line, whatever. So this hose here, this black one that feels like it's full of helium, it's very light, is just held in place with a 10mm bolt here, another 10mm bolt right there, and then there's a clip. It fits in that groove right here. So we've kind of just loosened that up. We're not going to take it out, just get it loose so you can move it around. Then I did go and remove a very long 10mm bolt from here, a long 10mm bolt from here, a 10mm bolt from over here that I did not need to remove, and I slid this thing out. So I unplugged it, and then it just slides all the way out towards the front, and then I'm going to let it hang. I can't figure out how to get the rest of this to come off because it's held in. There's 2 more 10s that go into the engine block from the right to the left, and this AC line's in the way. So I don't see a way to release that. So we're just going to leave it and hope that we can work around it. Now there's 2 bolts at this point holding in the alternator in addition to the electrical connections. The one alternator bolt is right at the tip of my finger, right here, and then there's another one up top just in the light on the other side of the pulley. And we're probably going to have to remove this idler pulley, but we'll let you know. So we're going to get some sockets on that, break those free, and see what we have to work with. Okay guys, this is an absolute blast. There is no room in here whatsoever. We were able to get the top part of this bracket off after we got the alternator off of its seats. The 2 nuts came out fairly easily. You don't really need anything special there. I think I mentioned the size was a 16. I'm pretty sure that is what it is. Then you kind of pry it to the right towards the driver's side and up. Then it gets loose. Then you rotate it around so you can undo the electrical connector, typical BMW tab, depress the tab, pull it off. And then you've got a 17mm black plastic nut that goes down over this spade connector, and that's the orientation of the spade connector. I wanted to be sure to film this before we removed the alternator finally. But the spade goes out and kind of into the largest part of the alternator here. So we're going to pull the spade connector off, then there's nothing holding it up in here. We're going to have to pull the hoses aside and wiggle it out. The old one's out and it's borderline impossible. There's just no room in here. Everything's in the way. Eventually you figure you have to turn the alternator backwards, and that gives you access to the connectors. We took the connectors off and then kind of have to put it back front ways again and up a little bit and then down and out, and you know, it's impossible, but it is possible because we did it. Day 2, let's talk about reassembly. So we've got the new alternator in. It's just as bad going as it was coming out, truthfully. So we put it in kind of backwards so we could see the back end of it. We put our 17mm nut on top of the spade, seat the spade over the stud, and then the 17mm nut. The torque for that's about 10 foot-pounds, so don't go crazy. And then the other line just snaps up on there. That's no problem. Then in this tiny space, you've got to fight and turn it around and get it lined up the right way. But before you bolt it in, this little lid, if you're like us and you took this little top thing off this bracket, make sure that that goes back on. And it's got these little fingers that stick through the side over here like this, and it only goes one way. It's easy to see if it's on right or not, but the back one's a little bit more challenging. It kind of has to come up, down, and then rotate down into place. So we got that in place. Then we lined up the radiator, or the alternator, which was surprisingly easy. Then the long bolt goes on the bottom, the short bolt goes on the top, and 34 foot-pounds is your number for that. So tighten both alternator bolts to 34 pounds. And then we went on to put the belts back on, starting with the primary belt. Hopefully you took a picture or just Google S85 V10 engine front and you'll find a nice diagram like I did on Google. But really no hints for that. You're going to need your 14 mil on your idler pulley. Open it up, make sure that the grooves are settled and seated the right way, or when you start the engine the belt's going to come flying off. So make sure that's right. Let's see, then we reassembled, or we installed this pulley up here that we had removed. So put that back in. It only goes one way. There's a little notch and a nub on it. Tighten that down. Also, we had this idler pulley off. I don't know if I mentioned that, to get the alternator out. So we put that back on, and there's no torque spec for it. You just pull it until it starts to open, and that's as tight as it wants to be. So then over here on the secondary belt, we put that pulley back on, I mentioned, with the nub, put the belts on there. This is your idler pulley over here. It's a 14 mil. Both idlers are 14. This other idler that is not a releasing pulley up here is a 16. So both belts are now back in. We put this cylinder back in the sleeve. We had to use some PB blaster to lube up the cylinder and then the little rubber ring around it. Plugged in the wiring harness. The wiring harness has a little clip here. Also, the wiring harness that feeds the alternator, the 17 mil nut and the regular plug, that has a little hook clip behind it as well. So if you can reach up in there and push the wires in the clip, that's ideal. If you can't, it's not the end of the world. It'll still work fine. So now we are ready to hook this thing back in, put those 10mm bolts back on this bracket that we had removed, and reinstall the caps over the bolts on the idler pulleys. So we're done working under the car now. We put back in the 10mm bolts all over this stuff, depending on how many you took out. You don't have to take all of them out. You do need to drop this hose, which would require this one, and then we took out these long ones. Now, there's one that's slightly different. It's got kind of a flange around the head, and it's the one that goes right here and holds the bracket with your AC lines onto the bracket that holds on your anti-roll bar. Notice that it is symmetrical to the one over here on the passenger side. So that's the one that's different. Don't make the mistake we did. It doesn't fit anywhere else correctly. So we're done with that. We're gonna lower the car back down right now and go back under the hood and put the electric fan back in and whatever else is up there. So for the last hour, we've been fighting with these little ears that stick off the side of the electric fan, and we've elected to put it back together without them. That is the single-handed worst piece of design I've ever seen from BMW. These things that only go one way and then they're supposed to fold out, but you can't fold them out. There's no way to get to them from the top, the bottom, the side. I can't imagine a proprietary tool that could do it. And even if you could hinge it out, then it becomes so flimsy that it falls off. And even if it didn't fall off, it wouldn't clear the radiator hoses. So we ended up trying to pull the radiator hose and put the fan in there with the little dog leg sticking out. That doesn't work, so we just took both of them off. They're not necessary. There's 2 pins at the bottom and 3 at the top that hold the fan on the radiator. We don't need the ones on the side. So then you put this piece of trim on top. They are T25s. I may have said T27s before. I don't know how those worked, but T25s work better, so do that. Press your coolant little bleeder lines or whatever back in the little clips. And now we're ready to move this back into place. Of course, remembering to plug in the horn on each side. So we're put back together. It's all just T30s up here, nothing special. And then we can put these back, these wires back in there. But give it a start. You know, it's throwing all sorts of codes for the headlights. Obviously they're not there, so high beam, low beam, side light, adaptive light malfunctions, that's expected, same as time and date because we had the battery disconnected. Don't forget to reconnect your battery. But we don't have an alternator or a battery charging malfunction error that we had before changing the alternator. And I put a voltmeter right on the jumper port here. So I use this nut as a ground stud, and then that is a positive, and I'm almost exactly at 14.00 volts. It's between 13.98 and 14.04, which is exactly what that 170 amp 14 volt alternator is rated at. So seems like a success. The belts didn't jump. We need to replace some coolant. We have the refinished wheels done with new tires on them today that we're going to go get shortly, and the bumper's about ready. So there's a lot more going on with this car. But thanks for watching the alternator DIY, and we'll talk in the next one. Take care, guys.